Hello everybody. My name's Dee Delaney Thiel. I'm a very, very proud Dunghutti woman from Australia. Dear delegates and Bureau, Sami Parliament, on behalf of the Global Indigenous Women's Caucus, I would like to give thanks for the opportunity to address all our Indigenous relatives here with us today. We would also like to acknowledge our Sami relatives as the traditional caretakers of this territory, and we thank them for welcoming us on their territories. We, the Global Indigenous Women's Caucus, are a caucus comprised of Indigenous women from all regions and have been meeting since 2001. The GIWC met for our preparatory meeting on the high-level plenary to be called the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples on March 27, 28 and 29 of 2013 at the American Indian Community House in New York, and we want to thank the Haudenosaunee for their hospitality and welcoming us onto their lands for that meeting. We took the following positions. We are extremely concerned that the Indigenous women and Indigenous youth have not been afforded full representation as a delegation under our own terms to this preparatory meeting for the high-level plenary to be called the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. Because many of our women participants were not able to attend through their own regions, our voices are being marginalised, and thus we have been made invisible and silenced even here within our own Indigenous peoples meeting. The Global Indigenous Women's Caucus urges reconsideration for full and effective, meaningful participation of Indigenous women and youth for any and all future participation in all meetings and activities related to the high-level plenary meeting on the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples. Over the 3 days of the caucus meeting, the caucus discussed its meaningful participation in the processes leading up to the United Nations General Assembly meeting. As well as themes and recommendations, the caucus would submit and strongly advocate for our issues to be included in the final recommendations for the high-level plenary meeting. The caucus has identified the following themes, which are core principles that have been included in our full submission to the processes. So the principles include our inherent rights to A, identity, B, culture, C, language, D, traditional, ancestral and sacred knowledge, E, educational and Indigenous identity. Our themes included rights of Mother Earth and our relation to Mother Earth, Millennium Development Goals, autonomy and integrity of Indigenous women and their bodies, Indigenous women's leadership and political participation, and Indigenous economy, around trading, commerce, and training Indigenous women to manage finances. So in regards to the rights of Mother Earth and our relation to Mother Earth, under the guise of development, massive destruction to Indigenous lands and territories have been caused by extractive industries, including pollution of lands and a legacy of contamination from radioactive waste. These activities have had a disproportionate impact on Indigenous women and children, threatening their health, including their reproductive health, and their lives. Environmental contaminants causing disease, birth defects and death are deliberately released into the environment because they are toxic to living things, e.g. pesticides, or as a result of industrial or military processes that are judged by states and corporations to pose an acceptable risk and allowable harm. States and corporations deny provable impacts despite the clear evidence that they cause a range of serious health and reproductive impacts which disproportionately affect Indigenous women and children. This constitutes environmental violence by states and corporations and must be identified as such by Indigenous peoples and human rights bodies. States and industry knowingly permit, produce, release, store, transport, export and dump hazardous chemicals that impair the endocrine and immune systems, adversely affect neurodevelopment and reproduction, and cause disease including all forms of cancer with few consequences. This is an egregious example of impunity. Unlike infectious diseases, environmental contaminants that causes disease and death are either deliberately released into the environment, specifically because they are toxic to living things, or they are a result of manufacturing from industrial or military processes that are judged by states and corporations. Sorry, I think I repeated myself. So the implementation is another theme. The recommendations that we had coming out of that area was that the outcome document affirms Indigenous peoples' right to free, prior and informed consent to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories or other resources as contained in Article 32, Paragraph 2 of the Declaration. That the outcome document affirms the right to water contained in UNGA Resolution 64292 with regard to Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous women and children, as well as other relevant resolutions. That the outcome document include a call to states to immediately halt ecocide by all forms of exploitation, commodification, and other assaults that impede or destroy the life-giving quality of water. That the outcome document affirms the rights contained in Article 25 and 26 of the Declaration, together with the rights contained in Articles 11, 12 and 13, including the rights of access to and protection of sacred places and sites located within their Aboriginal territories. We call upon the states to take measures to fully implement these rights. That the outcome document affirms the rights contained in Article 29 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That the outcome document affirms the right of Indigenous peoples to food sovereignty, to food security, bearing in mind the rights contained in international covenants and the Declaration. And also that the outcome document recognises the direct links between food sovereignty, environmental violence and reproductive health, and the specific impacts to the Indigenous women, children and unborn generations. The second theme was about in regards to the Millennium Development Goals. So Indigenous women and children continue to be among the most impoverished sections of our societies. The specific needs and circumstances of Indigenous peoples have not been adequately addressed and targeted by the Millennium Development Goals and in poverty reduction strategies. In reference to the MDGs, the UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon stated that we now have less than 1,000 days to close the gaps and accelerate action, which includes scaling up success, empowering women and girls who are critical to the process, keeping fiscal promises and mobilising people from governments to the grassroots. Our caucus agree with this statement and call to build the momentum needed to accelerate progress on the MDGs, in particular maternal health and gender equality. Our recommendations here were that the caucus proposes that we focus the theme to saying that we need to be enabling environments that are global in nature, sustainable in value, that truly respect and provide true recognition to Indigenous women's right to self-determination or right of self-determination and empowerment. That UNGA recommend that culture be integrated into the Millennium Development Goals as a pillar of any sustainable development strategy. That Indigenous people be included in the evaluation processes of the MDGs. Another theme that we had was the autonomy and integrity of Indigenous women and their bodies. One of the most pervasive human rights violations which affects Indigenous communities is the violence against women and girls. Customs, traditional practices and customary laws deny Indigenous women in some countries equality, and traditional values can at times justify the violation of Indigenous women. Violence against Indigenous women also affects their spiritual development and ability to perform their caregiving duties. Violence against women and girls need to define violence from the perspective of Indigenous women. We also need to bring back the attention of UN agencies to the violence against Indigenous women. Our recommendations, we have several recommendations there, but I want to stress two. So we're calling on a declaration on prevention of sexual violence in conflict, was agreed on Thursday 11th of April 2013 by the G8 countries. It states that rape and other serious sexual violence amount to war crimes and grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. This constitutes an emphatic reminder that states are required to investigate and prosecute conflict-related sexual violence wherever it occurs. This declaration only applies to sexual violence that occur in international armed conflict, where sexual violence is used as a weapon to silence non-violent political opposition. Another recommendation, we want to ensure meaningful participation of Indigenous women in the design, delivery, monitoring and evaluation of development of policies and programs in regards to domestic violence. That the UN World Conference create a special rapporteur to focus exclusively on human rights issues of Indigenous women and children, including but not limited to violence against them, and on changing state laws that discriminates against them. Issues of missing, murdered women and girls. So we have a couple of recommendations there, but I'll point out one, that the states commit to examine the reason for the failure to investigate the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and to take the necessary steps to remedy the deficiencies in the system. Human trafficking, we have a recommendation there, and it's cooperation and dialogue with states and Indigenous women and representative organisations to help develop adequate indicators for monitoring human trafficking and implementing effective laws and policies and strategies for the benefit of Indigenous women globally. Police violence and brutality against Indigenous women and girls, including sexual assaults, beatings and violations of their rights. For Indigenous women and girls in the world, the relationship with the police is already complex because of the failure of police protecting them in some instances. For Indigenous women who have faced abuse by the police, there is no adequate protection and no accountability for the violence that they face from the police or from other perpetrators. Indigenous women in the world, in some parts of the world, endure years of physical and sexual abuse, and these women, when reaching out to the police, do not receive their support. Instead, they suffer from police brutality and misconduct. Women can be kept in custody in extremely inadequate conditions while they are waiting for their trials or waiting to be released from custody. Some of these women do not have access to lawyers. There are issues of police ignoring complaints, dismissing women from the police stations, and women are encouraged to drop charges. We had a number of recommendations there, but I'll read one. States need to address the accountability of government bodies that have been charged with preventing and responding to violence against women, Indigenous women. There is to be a mandate for an inquiry team to investigate allegations of sexual assault by police on Indigenous women and girls. We also had a recommendation for women and children in conflict zones. Ensure that the survivors of sexual violence and wartime rape have full access to justice, access to medical support, economic assistance and accountability for perpetrators. Excuse me, I'm just taking it forward a bit because I know I've only got like a minute left. Our fourth theme was Indigenous women's leadership and political participation. We had a number of recommendations in that area there. Article 18 of our declaration provides that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own Indigenous decision-making institutions. Our last theme was around Indigenous economy. So I'll just read out a couple of recommendations that we had in that section, but we do have the full report. It's available if anybody wants a copy of it. So we are urging the states to promote the full and effective participation of Indigenous women, to have a greater participation in implementing policies and programs that affect them in regards to economic development. And finally, we urge the states to address the need for workshops to discuss how Indigenous women's unpaid work and care economy can be incorporated into sustainable development. I thank you for your patience.